Dear ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome from our side to all of you, also to all the people who are connected with us behind their screens via Zoom. It's a great pleasure for me also to welcome the president of the Vienna Working Group of Psychoanalysis, August Eichhorn, and all the members, August rules, okay. Freudian script. Warm welcome to the advisory board at the Region of Psychoanalysis, precisely in the Library of Psychoanalysis that serves the work for research for students, but not only, also a site and a venue for our events from our scientific program. And this, since the refurbishment of the museum, that was, the reopening was not that long ago, 2020, 3 years ago. And this opportunity to maintain a lively exchange at Freud's former place of work is important to, I quote, convey the pioneering spirit to which psychoanalysis owes its genesis and which is essential to ensure its preservation and continuing formation under the conditions of our contemporary world. Anna Freud wrote that at the beginning of the 1970s. And it was the spirit of this mission that the Sigmund Freud Lecture was introduced in 1970. And this still highlight of our annual program is being held today for the 50th time. And this featured experts from various disciplines, and so I may mention just a few of them to show what a broad range of expertise was presented here in Vienna to honor Freud's birthday. The very first lecturer was Rudolf Eckstein. He has to flee the Nazis too in 1938 and was a close friend of Anna Freud, who herself held 2 Freud lectures. And she was followed by the art historian Ernst Gombrich in 1981. Among the speakers in the 1990s were the linguist Claudio Magris, psychiatrists and psychoanalysts like Otto Kernberg, James Herzog, Vanik Volkan, and Andrea Sabatini, together with the great film director Bernardo Bertolucci. Other speakers from this distinguished group were the historian Carl Ginsberg, the neuropsychoanalyst Mark Solms, and Judith Mitchell, Jessica Benjamin, Moshe Zuckerman, Siri Hustvedt, Joseph Kossuth, Judith Butler, Slavoj Žižek, Stefano Bolognini, William Kindridge, Philip Blom, Jan Assmann, Jacqueline Rose, Colette Solier, and Lisa Apignanesi, who is also a member of our advisory board. Recalling these lectures helps to stress the main task of the Sigmund Freud Museum, our institution, to activate Freud's legacy for the current discourse and to show how meaningful psychoanalysis is in and for our days as a psychological treatment and, of course, also as a cultural theory. With this in mind, our advisory board has chosen Adam Phillips particularly well, and we are very pleased, Adam, that you accepted our invitation to come to Vienna. Adam Phillips is one of the most renowned Freudians and writers and ranks among the world's best-known psychoanalysts. With his very special approach to Freud, as can be seen from his many publications and will be heard, I'm sure, in today's lecture. And before handing over to Gohar Homayounpour, who is a report and will give a short introduction to Adam Phillips' work, I may briefly introduce her to you. Homayounpour is a psychoanalyst who studied in the United States and in Canada. Today she practices in Tehran as a training and control analyst in the Freudian group of Tehran that she founded and for which she served as its president, I think, for more than 1 decade. She is a member of the International, the American, the Italian Psychoanalytic Association, and also a member of the wonderful IGA group, Geographies of Psychoanalysis. Her writings are internationally published, like Doing Psychoanalysis in Tehran, that was translated into 6 languages and got the Gradiva Award. Her latest book, a wonderful publication, Persian Blues, Psychoanalysis and Mourning, was published last year by Routledge. And so before handing over to Gohar, I ask you to join me in welcoming Adam Phillips at Bergazineity.
Thank you, Monika. Good evening, everybody. It's my absolute pleasure to be here with all of you on this May 6th, 2023, to celebrate Freud's birthday here at Bergazineity and to introduce Adam Phillips, our 50th Freud lecturer. Adam Phillips is a psychoanalyst and essayist, as well as the general editor of the New Penguin Modern Classics Freud series. He was described as Britain's foremost psychoanalytic writer by journalist Joanna Cochella in The New Yorker and by the historian Elizabeth Rudinesco in Le Monde. The Irish novelist John Banville called him one of the finest prose stylists in the language, an Emerson of our time. He was formerly Principal Child Psychotherapist at London's Charing Cross Hospital. He's also a visiting professor in the English department at the University of York, as well as a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. But introducing Adam Phillips is no easy task, particularly since within my understanding of the Phillipsian of, he doesn't seem to me like a fan of being named, categorized, or identified. I presume he might find any type of introduction to him and his work quite horrifying after all, so I'll try to be as painless as possible. And so I will merely attempt to tell you about a few of the things that have affected and intrigued me the most about Adam Phillips over the years. There are many, but my time is brief. I think one can get a good feel for Adam Phillips by just breezing through the titles of more than 20 books that he's written over the years. In no particular order and just free associating, here are a few that come to mind. Darwin's Worms, On Kissing, Tickling, and Being Bored, On Flirtation, Missing Out, In Praise of the Unlived Life, Side Effects, On Balance, Becoming Freud, The Making of a Psychoanalyst, Unforbidden Pleasures, Monogamy, Promises, Promises, and most recently, On Getting Better and the Cure for Psychoanalysis. For me, Phillips makes a somewhere else possible within the poetics of the Freudian discourse. An elsewhere that is radical, revolutionary, strange, intriguing, and disturbing. Appreciatively, he doesn't give us a map of where that elsewhere might be or what it might look like. With Phillips, as in a good enough psychoanalysis, we don't have a clue where we'll end up, but we can be certain that this elsewhere will be turbulent, humorous, ironic, poetic, and above all, pleasurable, with all the inevitable troubles of pleasure. For Phillips, if one does psychoanalysis well, then it's unpredictable, for you never know where it's going or where you might end up. Freud knew this well, and that's why analysis is indeed a dangerous business, and why it should remain so. Phillips says there are two fundamental dangers. Firstly, being overwhelmed by excitement, and secondly, committing the crimes of excitement. For Phillips, the danger is the point and not the problem. And in that sense, psychoanalysis is subversive and its method revolutionary. In that sense, psychoanalysis is an elsewhere, out of time and out of space, so to speak. Indeed, rather alien-esque, psychoanalysis is certainly quite odd, and so is Adam Phillips, in the best sense of the word. Adam Phillips continuously takes us elsewhere. He has this beautiful phrase, the tyranny of purpose. In other words, the tyranny of thinking that we really know what we want. But he goes further than that, saying life cannot be just about wanting. He has this delightful example of distinguishing between taking a 3-year-old child for a walk or letting a 3-year-old child take you for a walk. In the former case, you have a purpose, taking the child to the park or the shops. But in the latter, the child would just go around in circles. You will not make it more than a few meters forward. The child is still not a slave to the tyranny of purpose. Phillips goes on to elaborate that we feel we're not going anywhere, whereas the child is going exactly where they want to go. This is how Phillips takes us and the 3-year-old child elsewhere. For me, Phillips only gives us a couple of clues in all of the Phillipsian of about this elsewhere. One clue to this elsewhere in my interpretation of Phillips is that if you want to get there, you have to become interested in other people, to come face to face with your own lack of centrality, along the lines of the ultimate Freudian message that we're not that central. In technical terms, and a la Andre Green, towards an objectalizing function of the drive. Or to put it in the words of the late Iranian film director Abbas Kiarostami, if you want to realize the ordinariness of your love story, you just have to look at someone else's. Hence, you have to look elsewhere. This elsewhere comes out of the dangers of a narcissism untouched towards an invitation to the outside world. It frees people to not be interested only in themselves. For if you're anxious or depressed, you're only interested in yourself. All of our symptoms, in a sense, for Phillips, could be out of an inflated interest in ourselves. So for Adam Phillips, it's not about getting better, not about getting somewhere. It's about getting worse, as he specifically says. And then seeing if we can bear the consequences of the worse we become, where we do not shy away from or omit the suffering that we might be inclined to try to avoid. For Adam Phillips, psychoanalysis is not about desire, it's about suffering. Adam Phillips elaborates that Freud had these strange and extravagant ideas and then is made anxious by them, and then he pulls back at times, which is quite charming in Freud, I find. But in Phillips's body of writing, that's what is delightful and what invites the reader to go for this walk with him in the park, is that he doesn't seem to be made anxious by extravagant and strange ideas. And through his lack of anxiety, we're invited to leave the tyranny of purpose behind and just enjoy the walk, or even just going around circles. If psychoanalysis is the process of strangification, the one signifier of psychoanalysis that I think we can't do without, Adam Phillips, for me, is the ultimate carrier of that signifier. Another clue for where this elsewhere might be is that this elsewhere is for sure a foreign land. Psychoanalysis is a process of foreignization, where the search is not towards belonging, but unbelonging. This praise of unbelonging for me is very close to Adam Phillips's notion of psychoanalysis being a profession for dreamers, for outsiders. In the final paragraph of his biography of Freud, Becoming Freud, the Making of a Psychoanalyst, he writes, "These, after all, were the themes of his psychoanalysis: the unofficial, the unspoken, the disapproved of, the disreputable, all as somehow essential for a kind of sociability Freud had intimations of, and that psychoanalysis would begin by describing. And in the last line of the book, but the psychoanalysis that the young Freud had invented was like its younger founder, something of uncertain status, something it was difficult to know what to make of, something for those eccentrics and dreamers who don't know what to make of themselves. This radical dream for psychoanalysis is indicated in the title of Phillips' lecture today, on not believing in anything, or why Freud. So on behalf of the scientific board here at the Freud Museum in Vienna, I thank you for accepting our invitation, and we look forward to you taking us elsewhere. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that. It almost goes without saying that I'm very glad to be giving this lecture in this particular building for an obvious reason. This lecture, as you know, is called On Not Believing in Anything, or Why Freud. The epigraph to the first section of the paper is a famous quote from Freud's 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, and it is, "Every finding of an object is in fact a refinding of it." I want to do a brief and impressionistic snapshot of cultural history through 2 great novels of and about Freud's times. Robert Musil's The Man Without Qualities and Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus, as a prelude to saying something about Freud and why Freud might matter and how his work might help us to find out what does really matter to us now. And particularly about how and why Freud's work addresses the question of belief, of what, if anything, we can believe in now, remembering Wittgenstein's famous question, is belief an experience? Wittgenstein being, of course, a contemporary of Freud's. And the question then becomes, above all, about what, if any, kind of believing is possible now, after the catastrophic cultural disillusionment of the First and Second World Wars, and their aftermath in which we are clearly still living. After the cumulative horror and trauma of these wars, there was a prevailing fear that what had to be given up was the capacity for belief in human nature, and so the giving up of belief itself. Belief being seen, as it was by Freud, as somehow linked to curiosity and the fear of curiosity. The word curiosity in English from the Latin cura, meaning care, and with the instructive definitions from the shorter Oxford English Dictionary. Quote, carefulness, scrupulousness, accuracy, ingenuity, subtlety, desire to know. Thank you. Desire to know or learn, inquisitiveness about trifles or other people's affairs, scientific or artistic interest, end of quote. Each of these definitions are clearly germane to psychoanalysis. The word curiosity, it should be noted, is used 90 times in the standard edition translation of Freud's works, the word curious used 85. Curiosity is, of course, one of the defining features of childhood, where all Freud's inquiries begin. That the history of a word is integral to its present usage was something that Musil, Mann, and indeed Freud were all duly attentive to. As men of their time and place, philology, and perhaps Nietzsche as philologist, haunts their work. So I want to give a brief and inevitably oversimplified account of what must be one among many of the cultural preconditions for Freud's work, and for the ambitions of psychoanalysis, of what psychoanalysis could have been invented to address, what psychoanalysis was, as it were, a response to and an intervention in, both for the individual lives of his contemporaries and in the wider culture. Psychoanalysis being about how and why we go about valuing people and things, and about how we find what we do value out of our own histories. Indeed, we might think of beliefs as it were, lying around, waiting to be found by us in the cultures we grow up in. And belief, of course, as a function of transference. And this brief history, as I say, of cultural conversation that Freud was joining in will be traced through these two great novels of the times. And by the times, I mean roughly the turn of the century until the end of the Second World War, and which are also, of course, two great novels set around and about the places where Freud worked and where psychoanalysis evolved. Musil's Man Without Qualities, written between 1921 and 1942, is set in a version of Vienna in the build-up to the First World War, and during, of course, the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It ends on what turns out to be the eve of the Great War, which its readers know and its characters, of course, cannot know. And Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus, published in 1947, which is set in Germany in the build-up to and during the Second World War, and ends as the war is ending with Germany defeated and in ruins. Both books, that is to say, at their most minimal, are about endings, virtually apocalyptic endings. And both books end in an explicit and profound despair. A despair about what is left for the survivors of these devastations to go on believing in. For the sake of this paper, I'm taking Dr. Faustus as a kind of sequel to, or continuation of, or even completion of The Man Without Qualities, both books being about this catastrophic cultural disillusionment that I want to discuss as the essential context of and precondition for the inventions of psychoanalysis. Both books are written in the knowledge that only the readers know the cataclysm of what happens next, and that they do know, and that their reading is overshadowed by this knowledge. As in psychoanalysis, and as Musil and Mann intimate, the past informs the future but does not determine or predict it. These are stories organized around the degeneration and death of cultures, and the mourning and denial entailed by the ruination of cherished and valued cultural ideals. And what we, the readers, know is devastating. Devastating because, among much else, the scale and depth of people's cruelty and destructiveness and depravity is utterly and irredeemably exposed by the two world wars and every country involved. And the question being, of course, in the light of these catastrophic events, what can we now believe about so-called human nature? And then by the same token, what, if anything, can we now believe in or rely on? And to elaborate further, we must remember, as I say, as a kind of side effect, Freud's contemporary, the philosopher Wittgenstein's question, is belief an experience? And of course, what kind of belief is an experience now? Clearly, it was not only religious belief that had been and was under threat, but belief itself. The question, what are we doing by believing or believing in something or someone? And once we have seen the catastrophe of having nothing to believe in Musil's novel, and the catastrophe of believing too much and too little in Mann's novel, it is our capacity for belief that is in question. What William James would call, in a memorable title, the will to believe. The psychoanalyst, we need to remember, is always paradoxically but implicitly asking the patient why he believes what the analyst is saying, if he does. What are the preconditions for such belief as he has in other people's minds? The first authoritative words being the words of the parents. No other kind of doctor includes, as part of the treatment, an analysis of the patient's confidence in the doctor, of the history of the patient's relationship to being helped. Clearly, a kind of foundational relationship. The psychoanalyst, taken to be only, as Lacan famously put it, the one who is supposed to know. So psychoanalysis invites us to wonder if the question is no longer, do I believe this, but why do I believe this? What other questions can we then ask as well? The British philosopher J.L. Austin, asked in his paper Other Minds, quote, "We seem never to ask, why do you know? Or how do you believe? What would a life without belief, without the possibilities or the opportunity for belief, look like or sound like? What kind of problem is, to use William James's title, the will to believe?" The Man Without Qualities, and the useful summary provided by the novelist Jonathan Lethem, who speculates that, quote, Freud, Musil's Vienna contemporary, perhaps served as a spur to the novel, is about, quote, the efforts of the aristocratic bourgeois echelons of Vienna to devise an anniversary celebration of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, adequate to rival the Prussian celebrations scheduled for the following year. The yearning to locate a sense of higher purpose for a lapsed and mongrel empire for which no such thing is possible. This satirical milieu, named the Parallel Campaign, hangs under the sword of Damocles. The horrors of the First World War would soon demolish every pretension and every platitude. End of quote. This absurd group try and find what is called in the novel a unifying idea, a higher purpose, something that they can all wholeheartedly believe in and promote, and that will bring them together. Nothing less was at stake, Musil writes, than the need to recover that unity of mankind that had been lost because the disparity of interests in society had grown so great. The question arises whether at the present time the peoples of today are still at all capable of such great unifying ideas. All the suggestions made so far by the committee were splendid, of course, but they diverged so widely, which already showed that none of them in fact had any unifying power. End of quote. The more people involved in political life, and without discernible sovereigns, it seemed the less unity was possible. And so there was the very real enigma of consensus in mass societies. The political solutions of the times being, as we know, fascism, communism and democracy. Do we have anything at all nowadays, Diotima, one of the characters in the novel, asks, that we can regard as truly important and great? Something worth working for with all our might? To which her colleague and friend Arnheim replies, quote, it is the mark of a time that has lost the inner certainty of healthier times, that is hard for something to crystallize as the greatest and most important thing of all. End of quote. The nostalgia, the idealizing of a more unified past here is patent and implicitly ironized. And the idea here of the greatest and most important things of all crystallizing suggests that it's simply a natural, organic process, something that just happens, and of course suggests there is such a thing as the greatest and most important thing. Of Ulrich, the anti-hero and central character of the novel, it is said, quote, he was doubtless a believing person who just didn't believe in anything. This becomes the emblematic characterization of many people in the novel, and the formulation of a cultural crisis. Religion, the state, the monarchy, the aristocracy, law, justice, art, sex, love and science all now prove insufficient. Generations of believing people, peoples whose lives have been inextricable from their beliefs, just didn't believe in anything now. It's implied in the title of the book that people who don't believe anything are people without qualities. After all, how can you have qualities or know what a quality is if you have no idea what the greatest and most important things really are? Whether or not it was strictly true, or true then in, say, Vienna, that erstwhile believing people no longer believed in anything, Musil is asking us to imagine such a possibility. An individual, a culture without belief, or a culture or individual suffering a kind of terminal skepticism, as though believing in anything was like a spell that could be broken. And Mann's Dr. Faustus, I take it, follows on from here. In the original 16th century Faust story, Faust sells his soul to the devil for pleasure and knowledge. And presumably one would only contemplate such a thing if the culture's prevailing values and pleasures were no longer sufficiently sustaining. And so by the same token, Adrian Leverkusen, the composer hero of Mann's novel, believes that now, quote, art has grown impossible without the devil's aid and hellish fire. That once the good or goodness no longer inspires one must look elsewhere. Effectively saying, as Milton's Satan does in Paradise Lost, evil be thou my good. The assumption being that people need something, an organizing idea or belief, if not the good, then evil, but something. Leverkusen's life story, as told in the novel by his friend, the academic Serenus Zeitblom, is explicitly paralleled in the novel by the rise and ultimate defeat of Nazism in Germany. of which Sigmund says, quote, "The empirical phenomenon of war appropriates what is in truth our yearning, our thirst for unification," end of quote. But it's perhaps worth adding here Hitler's insistence from the 1920s on that the Nazi Party needed, above all, what he called a coherent ideology, after what he felt to be the chaos, the disastrous defeat of the First World War and the Weimar Republic in the aftermath of the humiliating Versailles Treaty. And it's also perhaps worth adding here that Freud, whom Mann and Musil greatly admired, was to describe the modern human subject as by definition at odds with himself and others, ununifiable and fundamentally incoherent, in unrelenting internal conflict between rivalrous and contending parts of the self, and with others similarly divided. And so by the same token, as it were, always tempted by forms of sovereignty and mastery and unity, by the fantasy of the ego as master in what he took to be his own house. Always seduced by what the psychoanalyst Christopher Boehler calls the fascist state of mind, the militant narrowing of the mind out of fear of the mind's complexity. Of the way in which, in Musil's words, the belief of the individual now diverged so widely that political action seemed impossible, as though what was being discovered was the unfathomable complexity and diversity of the so-called human mind. Freud showed us how we were endangered by just how unconsciously prolific and disparate and conflicted our minds are, and endangered by our will to simplify ourselves. So without knowing what the greatest and most important things were, without unifying ideas, without infallibly coherent ideologies, what is to be done? What are people going to have, as we say, in common? Or what are they going to want to have in common? And when, to paraphrase Kafka, we have so little in common with ourselves. Why we have so little in common with ourselves, and why we don't want to have much in common with ourselves, being precisely what Freud was formulating in his psychoanalytic writing. What kind of sociability of relationship will be possible, both with other people and with oneself, in the light of this despair about our sociability? Where should our curiosity about ourselves begin? There is what one character in Dr. Faustus calls, quote, the loss of direct existential trust, which in ages past was the result of being thrust into a pre-existent unifying order, by which I mean arrangements impregnated with the sacred. This is a position vulnerable to demonic forces, end of quote. Loss of the sense of the sacred, for man here, opens the floodgates to something at its most minimal unknown, and at its most extreme, utterly terrifying. So it is Leverkusen's disillusionment with the traditionally good that is his demonic inspiration. By his absolute and absolutist disillusionment with Christianity, he gives up studying theology. With art, he has an acute and mocking ambivalence about German artistic culture and its traditions. With the idea of genius, which he consistently ironizes. With politics, which he has no apparent interest in. And with love and sex, he's described as essentially isolated, unable to love or be ordinarily friendly and affectionate. And the only sex he has in the novel is with a prostitute from whom he gets syphilis, and who is connected with the demonic corruption. Why, Leverkusen asks, quote, must almost everything appear to me as its own parody? Why must it seem to me as if almost all the means and contrivances of art nowadays are good only for parody? All is the word he insists on. Everything can only be mocked because everything has been seen through. Nothing is of substance. Nothing is unequivocally great or important. There is nothing there to take seriously or to protect. Sigmund tells us that, quote, a general attitude of intellectual irony towards art would so often emerge like an eerie stroke of genius in Leverkusen's later work, end of quote. Cynicism, irony and parody, and a certain kind of inner superiority are Leverkusen's modern refuges from the only available self-cures for an endemic personal and cultural despair. A despair and panic that is a foundational loss of confidence in modern so-called human nature and its so-called achievements. Freud, to put it as crudely as possible, lived and worked as an adult in the world described in The Man Without Qualities. And he left Vienna and eventually died in London, fleeing from the Nazis on the eve of the Second World War. That is to say, though Austrian, the history recounted in Dr. Faustus also overlaps significantly with Freud's own history and his passionate adoption of German culture. Freud's later professional life, the years in which he finally worked out and wrote about what became psychoanalysis, are the years covered in these great books. And we must remember, in addition, as it were, to the disillusionments that are at the heart of these books, that Freud and the fellow Jews of his generation, as we know, grew up through an earlier, different kind of radical disillusionment with liberal culture and the possibilities of assimilation. As Matt Fitch writes in his recent book on Freud, one factor, quote, one factor affecting Freud's shift from academic life to medical practice in his 20s was the changing political atmosphere in Vienna, which by the later 1870s had turned against both the liberals and the Jews, though the liberal ministry of 1867 must have seemed to the schoolboy Freud like a vindication of the eternal voice of reason and progress. During his student years, the political and economic map of Europe was being redrawn in ways that would have catastrophic consequences for Germanized Jews and the liberal regime on which their wager of assimilation depended. End of quote. Disillusionments of various kinds were the order of the day. The defeat of ideals and the antagonism that was a consequence of what many people referred to at that time as a cultural collapse, were the cultural climate of the times. Psychoanalysis, of course, will start from the position that human psychobiological development is a process of cumulative disillusionment and trauma. That we are essentially antagonistic, conflicted creatures, both intrapsychically and interpsychically. And antagonism itself was something, among other things, that psychoanalysis would radically redescribe and provoke. That from a psychoanalytic point of view, traditional distinctions begin to attenuate and blur. There is no them and us, the sane and the mad, the good and the evil, the primitive and the sophisticated, reality and fantasy. Or there is no them and us now because we are described by Freud as projecting the unacceptable, the inadmissible parts of ourselves, of which there seem to be many, into other people. That what we are also really up against is the unacceptable and inadmissible in ourselves. That the so-called evil, the destructiveness and vulnerability and despair we witness and experience in other people is not simply solely in the enemy. It is in us to varying degrees. It was not merely through the description of infantile sexuality that Freud spelled out the death of innocence. As he put it in his last book, The Outline of Psychoanalysis, quote, "We have recognized that it is not scientifically feasible to distinguish between what is psychically normal and psychically abnormal. So this distinction, despite its practical importance, has only a conventional value attached to it. We have thus established the right to understand the normal life of the psyche from its disruptions." End of quote. It is conventional values that will be the first casualties of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis will tell us that we can no longer seek the conventional consolation of believing that we are exempt from what appalls us or from what frightens us. We are complicit with what we are undone by. The enemy is always a part of ourselves and never quite so unequivocally simply the enemy. We always want to turn adversaries into enemies and then abolish them. Freud, in other words, like Musil and Mann, but in a different kind of language, is describing a loss of confidence in our knowledge of the good. Of the good as something we can both recognize and aspire to live by, whatever our versions of the good happen to be. After psychoanalysis, distinctions between good and evil become less tenable, less self-evident, as Nietzsche's notion of there being a beyond good and evil was beginning to come true historically. Loss of confidence, that is to say, in cultural ideals and so in human nature itself. Or to put it in the Freudian way, suspicion about both the superego and the ego ideal and of course the unconscious. suspicion about their provenance and their potential for cruelty. This is what became known in the modern disciplines of anthropology and sociology as the detraditionalizing of modern societies, and in psychoanalysis, a civilization and its discontents. We can neither agree about the good or even the valuable, nor straightforwardly aspire to it and protect it. This is what Musil and Mann and many others at the time were registering and representing in their writing. The risk was that the good or the valuable was going from something to be argued about to something whose very existence was being put into question. One implication was, of course, that there can only be an idea of the good if there is some kind of consensus about what the good is, and some kind of consensus about what consensus is, and some kind of consensus about what are the greatest and most important cultural ideals. And this is partly where Freud and psychoanalysis come in. This is where psychoanalysis joins in what was becoming an elaborate and contentious, and indeed still ongoing, cultural conversation. And this means Freud's radical redescription of the origins and functions of our cultural ideals and of our craving for authority, and his new description of the source and purpose of our cruelty and our destructiveness, and also of our sexuality. And of course, his assertions, at least initially, that the most important thing is our sexuality, whether we agree or not, and whether we think it great. And given our resistance to sexuality, Freud suggests we are very unlikely to agree about the importance of sexuality, or indeed about the nature of sexuality. Indeed, it will be one of Freud's more scandalous, more disruptive assertions, an assertion that radically disrupts our assumptions about morality, that we are as likely to resist our pleasure as to resist our suffering. Partly because our pleasure is forbidden, and partly because it reminds us of our potential for dependence, and partly because it threatens to be overwhelming. His other scandalous assertion is that we don't know what sexuality is, and we never will. Because sexuality for Freud, and desire for Lacan, is the important thing that paradoxically divides us against ourselves. Then resistance, part of what Freud will call the defences, becomes, as it were, the important thing. And then underlying and informing this, in some ways revolutionary description of what a person is the idea of the unconscious. Indeed, Freud is proposing, though he would never put it like this, that in Musil's language, the greatest and most important thing is the unconscious. The greatest and most important thing is that we are largely unconscious of ourselves. That the only question, as the French philosopher Michel Serres put it, is, what is it you don't want to know about yourself? What would it be, Freud gets us to wonder, to live in a society that believed in the unconscious? What could it possibly mean to believe in the unconscious? Which, of course, is not like believing in God, or love, or justice. It would be to believe that we are largely unaware of who we are and what we want, and that we mostly want to keep it that way because we're too disturbed by who we experience ourselves as being. Believing in the unconscious would clearly involve a different kind of believing, and of course, a different way of living. What kind of belief is that, or what, if any kind of believing, would that entail? It's partly the belief that we've become terrorized by who we happen to be or think that we are, and also that we've radically underestimated, radically underdescribed our pleasures. This, one might say, is entirely of a piece with the visions of Musil and Mann. Know thyself ultimately means, now for Musil and Mann, and partly for Freud, know how terrified you are of knowing yourself. Know how knowing yourself precipitates you into a kind of despair or terror. The question is whether it is the so-called self that is the problem, or the act of knowing. So I want to suggest in this lecture that it was through psychoanalysis that Freud was inquiring into the value and purpose and limits of so-called self-knowledge, and therefore of curiosity. Subjects, of course, integral to the work of Musil and Mann. That unconsciously, as it were, he was asking the pragmatic question, the question so usefully redescribed by William James and Richard Rorty. In what sense does self-knowledge now get us the life we want? In what sense is the conventional project of knowing ourselves a good way to spend our time? What can self-knowledge do for us now? And what, to ask the psychoanalytic question, can so-called self-knowledge be a defense against? What might we be using even psychoanalysis itself to resist about ourselves? Freud, that is to say, who counsels us that we are always ambivalent about everything we value, that is, how we know we value something because we love and hate it, makes us wonder through psychoanalysis about our ambivalence about the time-honoured project of knowing ourselves, and indeed wonder about our ambivalence about psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis can never exempt itself, can never be immune from its own questions. Why do psychoanalysts never speak of what they hate about psychoanalysis? Through psychoanalysis, Freud was finding out about both the resistance to self-knowledge, but also about the limits and the limitations of self-knowledge. Where and how self-knowledge didn't work, didn't make the difference. Psychoanalysis would show Freud, among many other things, where self-knowledge was not the point, or beside the point, or was itself a defence. And then what we might believe in when our belief in self-knowledge breaks down or is revised. As much as showing us what self-knowledge might entail, how it, in the words of the critic R.P. Blackmure, adds to the stock of available reality, Freud showed us what self-knowledge can't do for us, and what the limits of self-knowledge might be. What we believe is a function of our self-knowledge, of what we take ourselves to be. The question becomes, more than intimated by Freud, how complex can we allow ourselves to be? And then, what can we then believe and believe in the light of our acknowledged complexity? And can knowledge foreclose desire? There are two epigraphs to the second section of this paper. The first one is from Carlyle's Sartor Resartus. The folly of that impossible precept, know thyself, till it be translated into this partially possible one, know what thou canst work at. And the second is from the Irish novelist Sebastian Barry's The Temporary Gentleman. What strange men were about the earth after this half-century of wars. Of course, believing that there is nothing to believe in is as omniscient in its way as knowing what is to be believed and knowing how to believe. The temptation of omniscience is as alluring as the temptation of skepticism. When, to take two of Freud's most significant followers, Ferenczi suggested that the patient is not cured by free association, he is cured when he can free associate. And when Lacan suggested that the analyst starts explaining when he becomes frightened of his curiosity, they are both referring to the analyst's recourse to omniscience, to knowing more than he could possibly know, and to his investment in the being the one who knows as opposed to the one who is supposed to know. As though, at least in these two examples, knowledge is a self-cure for some kind of anxiety. Call it the anxiety about desire, about the desire not to know. When the patient can free associate, he has, as it were, access to an unfathomable unconscious that is only to a limited extent subject to interpretation or explanation or formulation. Interpretation and explanation being at best part of the analyst's containing function, and at worst a preemptive strike against the unconscious in all its prolific, untrackable vagrancy. The unconscious is what Deleuze and Guattari famously called a desiring machine. The image is of something interrupted or redescribed or formulated, as opposed to something that flows and digresses and proliferates. And it is, of course, easy with this kind of imagery in play to idealize the fluid over the fixed, the open over the closed, the mobile over the monumental, in that rather hackneyed version of Romanticism, as in some stark, oversimplified opposition to the Enlightenment. And even though it makes a certain kind of sense to talk of a romantic Freud and an Enlightenment Freud, it's always worth noting where Freud in his writing wants to stop, to put a stop to something, and where he finds himself unable or unwilling to. Especially since the project of psychoanalysis for Freud was about the possibility of unbounded curiosity. In his thirst for truth, Lacan writes in Seminar 11, Freud says, "Whatever it is, I must go there, because somewhere this unconscious reveals itself." End of quote. One of the familiar ways in which this turns up in Freud's work is in his intermittent and unelaborated skepticism about empirical science. We have found it necessary, Freud wrote in 1913, to hold aloof from biological considerations during our analytic work and to refrain from using them for heuristic purposes, so that we may not be misled in our impartial judgment of the psychoanalytic facts before us." End of quote. The implication being that psychoanalytic facts are different from the empirical facts of biology. Biology can help us explain in its commitment to the empiricism of causality, but it might, in its commitment to empirical reality, foreclose the delirium of free association. Psychoanalysis, Freud would write in 1916, quote, "must keep itself free from any hypothesis that is alien to it, whether of an anatomical, chemical, or physiological kind." End of quote. If we exempt psychoanalysis from biological considerations and from anatomical, chemical, or physiological hypotheses that are alien to it, what then are to be the criteria relevant to or pertinent for psychoanalysis? What kind of hypotheses are not alien to it? This is certainly not an account of psychoanalysis as straightforwardly a science, or as a science of a recognizable or traditional kind. Despite, of course, Freud's insistence that psychoanalysis be a science and that there was nothing else it could be. It was always a question for Freud, that is to say, who did he want psychoanalysis to be judged by? As he famously wrote in his autobiographical study, quote, "Neither at the time nor indeed in my later life did I feel any particular predilection for the career of a doctor. I was moved rather by a sort of curiosity, which was, however, directed more towards human concerns than towards natural objects." End of quote. So his project was not primarily to heal or cure people, to be a doctor who knows about that natural object, the human body. And in this strange and interesting distinction, he claims to be curious about human concerns as opposed to natural objects. And so we're provoked to wonder what human concerns are if they are an alternative to or in opposition to natural objects. And we need to note that the emphasis is on curiosity here, and by implication not just on empirical knowledge. What is a curiosity about human concerns that does not involve a curiosity about natural objects, and that is not only empirical? As a committed Darwinian, there could be nothing supernatural about human beings for Freud, nothing that was not natural. So we can see that in these ambiguous and provocative distinctions that Freud is struggling to articulate, there's something that is very important too. That psychoanalysis was his way of being curious about human concerns without, as it were, being waylaid by scientific knowledge and the amelioration of human suffering. Psychoanalysis, as presented here by Freud, was difficult to classify or even to clearly describe. But it was for Freud, its founder, about curiosity. Psychoanalysis, that is to say, as being essentially about curiosity, rather than, or as well as, about knowledge or even cure. Psychoanalysis being about, among other things, to refer back to Ferenczi and Lacan, the way in which knowledge, the will to knowledge, can itself be a defence against curiosity. And also that the will to cure and be cured can be a foreclosing of curiosity. Curiosity, one might say in this context, being an essential human concern, and not least because it tends to undo, to dissolve essentialisms, because it tends towards the unknown and the potentially unknowable, or as yet unknown. Daring and unrestrained imagination always stirred Freud, as Ernest Jones wrote in his monumental quasi-official biography of Freud. It was an integral part of his own nature to which he rarely gave full rein. The sight of this unchecked imagination in others was something Freud could seldom resist. End of quote. Psychoanalysis and psychoanalysts after Freud have divided over whether psychoanalysis was a curiosity profession or a knowledge profession, whether it was more essentially about cure or exploration. The curious, the explorers, can never settle. Those who are keen on being knowledgeable and helping people want to settle when it is at all possible. Or to put it another way, when we're not saying curiosity leads to knowledge, we can say curiosity leads to curiosity. That we're not wanting to come to conclusions, but to come to beginnings. That psychoanalysis, in the title of the analyst, J.B. Pontilis's great autobiography, is about love of beginnings. What would it be, Freud asks through the disordered medium of psychoanalysis, to believe in curiosity as opposed to believing in science, or religion, or politics, or in psychoanalysis, or even in nothing? If you believe in curiosity, what do you then believe in? You certainly believe in free association, and you can only believe ambivalently in explanation. You can believe in delirium, but only ambivalently in clarity. It's clearly not incidental, to go back to one of the beginnings of psychoanalysis, that when Freud starts becoming preoccupied by sexuality and its place in psychic life, he becomes interested in the origins and the purpose of the child's curiosity. Curiosity both about sex and about whatever else. And Freud's belief that curiosity starts as curiosity about sexuality and then continues in displacement to be about sexuality is an early example of Freud's wish to fix and preempt curiosity with a known object or target. It is Freud's ambivalence about curiosity, not his commitment to it, that is discernible in his emphasis on sexuality. To be interested in childhood, as I say, is to be ineluctably interested in curiosity. The child who knows very little and who is not known for his empiricism is exorbitantly curious. The curiosity about human concerns that Freud begins with becomes itself the subject, the means and the end of his new discipline. A psychoanalyst then is someone who is above all curious and curious about curiosity. And psychoanalysis itself may be more of a curiosity profession than a helping profession, while keen to work out the connections between the two. A psychoanalyst is not someone who needs to know, not someone who needs to be right or needs to be believed. He is someone who, among much else, analyses resistances, even if it sounds oddly old-fashioned now to say such things. But it is the resistances to curiosity that are to be analysed. Resistance is always and only resistance to curiosity. We suffer, Freud suggests, from being insufficiently curious about our suffering. And one of the aims of psychoanalysis should be to get the so-called patient curious about his suffering and indeed about his pleasure. We are not curious enough about what we believe and don't believe about ourselves and other people. And so, to pick up the title of my talk, not believing should provoke as much curiosity as believing. This is what Freud is drawing our attention to. He wants us to be curious about belief and disbelief, and indeed about the inability to believe. A curiosity about the malaise of his time and of ours. And for Freud, as I say, this begins with the child's curiosity about sex, and what a curiosity about sex is assumed to be a curiosity about, and why it might matter. The risk for the psychoanalyst, Freud almost intimates, is that she becomes more interested in psychoanalysis than in other people. The third and final section of this paper, and the briefest, you'll be glad to know, is from Iris Murdoch's essay, Against Dryness. And the quote is, "A simple-minded faith in science engenders a dangerous lack of curiosity about the world, a failure to appreciate the difficulty of knowing it." Babies and young children seem to live as if they believe in appetite and comfort, and initially at least as if they believe in their parents or whoever looks after them. Though it sounds odd to talk about babies believing in hunger, though possibly slightly less odd to talk as adults about believing in sex or love or romance. And it would be interesting for someone who claimed, say, to believe in sex, to tell us what believing in sex was believing in. Or to tell us what believing in sex added to sex. It becomes a question then of what belief justifies or vindicates, as if to believe or believe in something or someone is a form of permission. Whatever the preconditions for belief, it always has significant consequences. When we talk about belief, we tend to talk about what it is to live as if something were true, and therefore essential to the lives we want. For Freud, the other thing that the child seems to believe in, as well as hunger, well-being and the parents to which it's linked, is his or her curiosity. The progressive concealment of the body, which goes along with civilization, Freud writes in the 3 essays, quote, keeps sexual curiosity awake. The curiosity seeks to complete the sexual object by revealing its hidden parts. It can, however, be diverted, sublimated in the direction of art. We've learned from psychoanalysis that the instinct for knowledge in children is attracted unexpectedly early and intensively to sexual problems, and is in fact possibly first aroused by them. End of quote. It's often Freud suggests that the birth of a new usurping baby stimulates necessary interest in where babies come from, and that the perception of the difference between male and female bodies, and particularly their genitalia, that provokes the child's quest for knowledge and understanding. But there are two other points Freud wants to stress. Firstly, that concealment incites curiosity, and that what he calls in a telling phrase the instinct for knowledge, and what he calls the diversion of art, is first aroused by sexual problems. Sexual problems for the child being sexual mysteries and curiosities. It is as though, at least in Freud's account, that the child's psychic survival depends upon his curiosity about sexuality and his willingness, as far as is possible, to see it through. It's almost literally his curiosity about sexuality as an essential part of his psychobiological development that precipitates the child into the future. His future is the wished-for, ongoing satisfying of his curiosity. And the child believes that there are forms of knowledge that are the self-cure for the curiosity that is driving him. Knowledge as the cure for curiosity, when it may be, as Freud intimates, that it is the child's curiosity that sustains him if he can bear it and bear with it. The right kind of knowledge inspiring further curiosity, not putting a stop to it. Freud, as a man of the Enlightenment, so to speak, believes in knowledge, but he also shows us how knowledge can be the death of curiosity. And the curiosity may be the most sustaining form our desire takes. Indeed, we may be drawn to knowledge because it is the death of curiosity. A moment's thought shows us that all the famous so-called psychoanalytic symptoms, hysteria, obsessionality, phobias, etc., are all, among other things, attacks on, attempts to sabotage or waylay curiosity. Freud also stresses, though, along similar lines, that sexual fantasy is a form of belief. That once the children are called the so-called facts of life, he tells us, once they are informed of the biological facts of reproduction, that, like, as he puts it, primitive tribes converted to Christianity, they go on, as he puts it, worshipping their old idols in secret. Their own sexual theories about men and women and where babies come from prevail for some time over the empirical facts. In other words, children, like adults, are profoundly ambivalent about their curiosity. They want to know and they don't want to know. They want certainty and they don't. So Freud, in this example, invites us to wonder what are our beliefs, often our most rigorously adhered to beliefs, racial, sexual and class prejudices, for example. What are they ways of not knowing about? What our cherished beliefs protects us from knowing or acknowledging or being curious about. Freud says what the child does and doesn't want to know about is sexual difference and the sexual relation between the parents and his own incestuous desire. But we should also read Freud's writing in the way he taught us to read dreams. We shouldn't, that is to say, be overly impressed by what the dream foregrounds or highlights. We should notice what the dream hides through underemphasis. So in this instance, we might relegate Freud's insistence on sexuality and take more seriously the child's curiosity in itself. By persuading us that the object of the child's curiosity is sexuality, Freud tends to diminish our interest in the phenomena of curiosity. As if to say, what we're really interested in is sex, not curiosity. Curiosity is just the way we get to sex. While we can, and perhaps should, take Freud's propositions about sexuality very seriously, we can also take them to be Freud's way of saying that there are things, not only already known things, not only, say, the knowledge psychoanalysis has accrued. We use our beliefs and our believing to hide ourselves from and to hide from ourselves. Freud telling us what we're really curious about shows us why we may be so keen to be so knowing about our curiosity. By telling us that, say, sexuality is the thing, he's also assuaging our anxiety about what we may not yet know and about what we may want to know. And he may also, of course, be helping us with our prolific anxieties about sexuality and dependence. Why Freud? Because Freud shows us how the hide and seek of our modern lives works, and that hide and seek may be an enlivening way of describing our lives, and that hide and seek may make us curious about other ways of describing our lives, and curious about why hide and seek has become such a compelling picture. And so we're left to wonder what might make us incurious at any given time about our lack of belief, or about an excess, a fanaticism of belief, as portrayed in The Man Without Qualities and Dr. Faustus. It could be said that both books, for very good reasons, are about the defeat of curiosity, and about a despair about there being now a life-sustaining and enlivening form of curiosity. Freud's work starts from the position that for better and for worse, with no way by definition of knowing the consequences, with no way of knowing beforehand what matters, we need to be curious about our curiosity. We have, as Freud showed us through psychoanalysis, our curiosity and our morality to be going on from, and our curiosity about them. Our curiosity up against our morality and in collusion with it. And as Freud also intimated, belief without curiosity is one of the forms that death instinct takes. Belief without curiosity is stultifying, and that may be its point. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this wonderful lecture that has made us definitely more curious about things. And so I think that because of the time, I'd like to open it up to the audience. I know we have 200 people on Zoom also. So please, comments, questions.
Do feel free not to speak.
Please, Professor Gallo.
Yes, thank you very much for... the microphone. Sorry. Yeah.
Is that?
It's true. Thank you. Thank you very much for this illuminating lecture full of different avenues to think about these issues. And thinking about The Man Without Qualities, one of the interesting things about the novel is that it's the portrayal of a very specific historical period and the decay of a society in that historical period. So I was wondering if curiosity, if we could think of it historically, are there some historical periods in certain places that show more curiosity in general, and then some moments in which curiosity seems to be closing down or disappear? And how would you diagnose the moment we're living in right now?
Well, I can't diagnose the moment we're living in now, because I'm averse to so grandiose statements. But I do think, of course, you're right, that curiosity is historically and culturally conditioned. It must be. And so in a way, you could think, well, this is what psychoanalysis is on about here, which is what kind of conditioning of our curiosity are we suffering from? And how is there a way of knowing or learning about the constraints on our curiosity? Because you'd think if the culture works, then of course we wouldn't think we were constrained. We would be thinking we're curious about exactly the right things. Even if we can't get anywhere with it, we know what we should be interested in. Well, we know the culture is, as it were, telling us what we should be interested in. And I think psychoanalysis is an attempt to broach whether it's possible to acknowledge there are other people in the world. And that being a real question.
It's so interesting along the lines of the question and what you responded. I was thinking with what you ended, this idea of hide and seek, cash. I think it's the human right to be able to experience that. And I was thinking that in a sense, it's the moment the mother, the primary object, the maternal object, is absent, that becomes a possibility. So she has to hide first in order for the possibility of this thinking, curiosity, desiring subject to develop. If she doesn't hide, because I think the way it works is first the child thinks, well, okay, my mother is not with me, let's just say mother, then my mother is not with me, where is she? But even more interestingly, I think, with whom is she now? You know, this is like the seed of curiosity.
Yeah, well, I think in a way, the child's assumption, obviously I'm making this up, but the child's assumption is not the mother's absent, but she's hiding. She can't be absent because she adores me, so she must be hiding from me. And that's how I think this works. I mean, Winnicott says a very, very interesting thing somewhere where he says, it's necessary to hide, but it's a catastrophe not to be found. And that seems to me both good and true and interesting. And that there could be, in an awful lot of hiding, is a love test to find out about seeking. And that's a very good reason to hide.
Please. Do we have a way to get over?
Thank you very much for this brilliant paper. I'm, from time to time, listening to you, I was always playing with the translation of Neugier and curiosity. And Neugier, by Freud, is linked to scopophilia and the drive of power. And I think in the translation into English, this greed which is in curiosity is a little bit lost. And what is lost also is the nearness, the closeness from curiosity to a kind of perversion.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, there is another thing very close to curiosity, even in English and in German, the desire to know. Can we, which is a sublimation, a kind of sublimation of curiosity. Would you
well, I mean,
something to
it sounds right. I don't speak German, so I don't know that bit. I do think that it's rather a super egoic version of curiosity, because I think what I want to propose here is that by linking curiosity with the forbidden, we preempt it. Because it seems to me an awful lot of curiosity may not be about forbidden things. But you can see the move here, which is you attach it to the forbidden and then you try and stop it, or you prohibit it, or you restrict it. So I think what I'm interested in is two things. One is, clearly curiosity must be partly about what is forbidden, and therefore must have a transgressive element, as it does in the idea of scopophilia, but it doesn't have to be exclusively that. And also it would seem to me that that in curiosity there's a probe, that it's an attempt to find out A, what is forbidden, and why it might be forbidden. Because it's not so the forbidden is settled once and for all. So it seems to me to be able to be curious about it is to test it, is to wonder about it, is to be able to think about it, as opposed to simply abide by it.
Maybe one sentence.
I have a question from our Zoom audience. Or is that question related?
I think this gentleman was about to ask a question.
Thank you very much. Only one short opinion. So I looked into the Google translation because I come from Ukraine and I'm not so familiar in English and German translation and vice versa. But I looked for the translation of gear. What is gear, I know because I'm German speaking primarily. What I looked in the translation, that is greed. Greed for news. the greed has a little bit of biological component. That is maybe the big difference if the Freud says about the Neugier. It has a little bit the nature of biologists, or in parentheses. What do you think?
Well, I think, I mean, the idea of greed is very interesting, isn't it? Because on the one hand you could think, who's deciding what is greed? What are the standards for greed? Well, obviously that's arbitrary, so to speak, and contingent. But also you might think developmentally that very often greed is a reactive to deprivation. And that doesn't therefore indict it. It just means we can then ask the question, what's the deprivation? What's frustrated the child or the adult such that they want this kind of excess? And of course we know that one of the things about greed is it's often in displacement. I don't actually want to eat 10 bars of chocolate, but I do want something very badly. But of course I'm dependent upon the external world to read my desire in that sense. So when I start eating my 3rd bar of chocolate, I need my mother or father or someone to come along and put a stop to it, and have a conversation which I might think of what I do want. So I think that the risk is, I think curiosity must be linked to greed, but I don't think it's only greedy. And if it is greedy, the greed could be justified. In other words, there's something here I need more of, and my environment has made me feel ashamed of this need, and called it greed. And this can be terrible, it seems to me.
Adam, that was a wonderful lecture, and I was wondering whether you could explain more carefully the linkage between Musil and Thomas Mann as a frame. One way to understand the linkage might be that Freud is saying to Musil and Mann, you're asking the wrong question. The issue is not why we're no longer able to believe anything, but the very idea of a uniting belief is false. And that in the ruin of these certainties, what we need to do is go back to understand what belief is and think about the dangers of belief and begin to ask ourselves how beliefs get generated in us in its relation to curiosity. In other words, I'm trying to connect where you end with the framing at the beginning and understand the connection.
Yes, I mean, I don't. But I think obviously this is a real question, because it would seem to me that I don't know if it's right that Freud would think that, I mean, speaking on Freud's behalf now, that Freud would think that Musil and Mann were asking the wrong questions. I think that Musil and Mann are giving descriptions of a predicament, and that Freud joins in a conversation about this predicament. And I think Freud can't help but be really interested in what we're doing when we are believing. In other words, what do we want from belief would be a Freudian question, if you see what I mean. So I think the Musil-Mann-Freud connection, for me, and it is genuine, this is not a modest comment, but it's kind of simple-minded, because all I can see is that in reading these novels, there really is a powerful overlap of preoccupations that I can see, and I can, to a limited extent, discern it. But it seemed to me not that Mann and Musil were, as it were, suffering from either a lack of curiosity or the wrong kind, that they were living in a culture that didn't sustain the possibility of belief, as though belief had become redundant, or people literally didn't know how to do it, because they weren't sustaining. There were people asking themselves questions when they wanted to be able to take things for granted, so they could do other things. And you get a very strong, get a very strong feeling when you read these novels of really worlds falling apart. And even though it can be satirized, ironized, etc., it's really disturbing. And they're amazingly novels because they hold your attention through all this ruination. And that seems to me phenomenal, incredible. And then you read Freud, and Freud is describing in a completely different language what might make people feel that they believed in unity at all. How did that come about? Seems extraordinary in retrospect, but on the other hand you think, how do you live without it? I think those are kind of my preoccupations.
I'm not sure what I'm going to say. But I'm very curious about the way in which Musil, in the last and unfinished volume of Man Without Qualities, actually allows a kind of side of belief in something which is indeed curious, which is brother-sister incest. And, I only mention that word because incest, of course, forms part of the Freudian world of curiosity. And I wonder what you make of that, because he does seem, for at least 2 minutes, Musil, to see some kind of hope, at least for his hero, in this twosome.
Yeah, I mean, he makes a very compelling case for brother-sister incest. And you think this is a great romance. And these two people really have an affinity for each other, and they really have a future together. And that seems to me to be interesting, because obviously everybody's going to go, oh, that's disgusting, that's impossible, etc. But actually, you read this novel and you think, that is interesting. That is a curiosity. People may be very repressed in their curiosity about their siblings. Certainly they may be extremely frightened of their love and desire for their siblings. You think, well, why? Why do you need to be that frightened? There could be lots of answers to that question, but nevertheless, this is the beginning of one's relations. It's got to be compelling. And often it's easier for people to talk about the forbidden in relation to parents than in relation to siblings. And so what Musil does, I think, at the end of the novel is doesn't say it literally, but everybody's heard of the Oedipus complex. But let's talk about incest between siblings and wonder what we're doing when we call it incest. And that, I think, is really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so I'd like to ask a few questions from our Zoom audience. The first being, do you feel that the relational branch of Freud's psychoanalysis opens or closes curiosity of the patient's inner life?
Well, it would depend which psychoanalyst we're talking about. I don't think in and of itself it does, but I think we who are psychoanalysts must all have inherited, not only Freud's, but ambivalence about curiosity. What's wonderful to me about Freud is that he gives us a very good story about ambivalence. That with Freud's always one step ahead of being behind himself. And so he's always giving us something useful to make of where he gets stuck. And it seems to me that he shows us why and how come we might be ambivalent, and what, if anything, we might be able to do about it. Because I don't think it's that we should get over our ambivalence about curiosity. I mean, it would be as silly to think it was wonderful as to think it was terrible. But it would seem to me good to be able to sustain the ambivalence, to acknowledge the contradiction as opposed to try and resolve it, and assume that the ambivalence was integral, not alien to the project. That's exactly the point, that we love where we hate and hate where we love. And that's where the action is. It's not about resolving this.
And another question about ambivalent relations. Could you please speak about ways in which curiosity and belief can be related to each other, in which belief is not a defense against or an end to curiosity?
Well, I suppose this is a little glib, but the point would be that the question would be how much any belief or state of conviction preempts curiosity, and what it preempts curiosity about. You could say, put it extremely, that any kind of belief is the attempt to circumscribe curiosity. And it seems to me psychoanalysis addresses this very interestingly, because it says wherever it is you're trying to close the system is potentially where the action is. That it's all about purity and danger. So that you can see when you're struggling for purity that something else is going on that's very enlivening. And the risk is you get stuck with trying to get rid of the danger. That you really begin to believe in purity, and then you are really stuck.
Questions here in the audience?
Thank you for the lecture. Towards the beginning, you mentioned that there was this paradox of a desire for, of an aversion to pain and also an aversion to pleasure. Does this in any way relate to the paradoxical desire for certainty but also for ignorance, or are they unrelated?
I think they must be related. I mean, Bion has this very interesting comment somewhere where he says the child needs to learn to suffer pleasure as well as to suffer pain. And so, obviously, the implication, which is quite a psychoanalytic one, is that neither of these things come, as it were, naturally to us. That it's a culturation that we have to learn how to bear these things and whether we want to bear them. So I sort of think that there's got to be a connection between the curiosity you can bear and the beliefs you're drawn to. And you could think, tell me what you believe and I'll tell you what you're not curious about. Mm-hmm. Something like that.
I just wanted to ask what was the last sentence of your paper again? Because I think,
one of the best experiences I ever had was I gave a paper in Massachusetts, and the first question was, could you read that paper again? I'll have to read you the last 3 sentences because they may have sounded like one. As Freud also intimated, belief without curiosity is one of the forms the death instinct takes. Belief without curiosity is stultifying, and that may be its point.
Thank you. So maybe there's a question I want to try to add, whether this could also be part of this sentence that if we believe whatever we believe, we also need the curiosity to find out whether we believe the right thing for us. Is that also a link?
Yeah.
Maybe?
I mean, the link would be, following on from your question, would be trying to find the conversations that might be useful in understanding something about the belief. That this isn't something that's going to go on someone's mind by themselves. But if you begin to believe something, it would seem to me probably quite good to have conversations with people you love and like and hate about the subject and see where it takes you.
Thank you.
I think we still have a little bit of time, no? For maybe 1 or 2 more questions. I think she's going to ask a Zoom question and then...
I've got a question on Zoom from someone from Lisbon. What role does transference neurosis play in the need to accept curiosity?
Well, you could think that a transference neurosis is a way of preempting one's curiosity about one's analyst, in the sense that transference means that at some level I already know exactly who my analyst is. That's the point. So there's no news. I haven't met a new person. They look like a new person, but obviously they're not. And I know exactly who they are. And so it would seem to me really what we're talking about when we're talking about curiosity is we're talking about the allure of omniscience. That omniscience is the real problem, the real human problem. Having recourse, this sounds terribly grandiose, but anyway, that having recourse to one's internal omniscience is the sign of real anxiety. That's how you know there's real anxiety, and the anxiety is always about curiosity. I think there's a question here.
Yeah.
Thank you. You didn't invite me, or you didn't make me want to qualities again, because I find myself in your what you say about it. But I definitely have to reread Dr. Faustus again, because for me the lasting impression of Dr. Faustus is this, while The Man Without Qualities is such a chilling book, the Dr. Faustus was for me such a emotion steering book of this clash between the terrible first half of the 20th century in Germany and this longing, this pervert longing for a mystic medieval German original status of I don't know what, yeah, and it makes me curious to reread it with your interpretation, and perhaps you have some guiding 3 words for me before I do.
Well, the first bit of guidance is you must reread The Man Without Qualities. Because it is really fabulous. So you should do that first. I think this is an oversimplification. I think what's heartening about Dr. Faustus is that, apart from that it was wonderfully written, is that it seems to really embody the Nietzsche thing about we have art that we may not perish from the truth. And you sort of think Mann really believes that. And so in a way does Leverkusen at some level. So that, thank God, we're aesthetes, fundamentally. And that's heartening or catastrophic, depending on what you happen to prefer.
So thank you for 2 homeworks, and I have to start, as a Viennese, I have to start here with the Vienna.
Yeah, this evening.
Should we ask one more Zoom question?
Okay, another some questions. In your point of view, psychological currents like positive psychology, did you hear me?
Yeah, I think so. So could you say that bit
In
again?
your point of view, psychological currents like positive psychology are manifestations of resistance and defense mechanisms against human failures and unknowns?
Well, I wouldn't be keen to generalize about this, because we'd have to see in each specific instance. I mean, you have to see if positive thinking works for you. And if it doesn't, then you have to do something else. But I think it would be naive just to say, oh no, it's obviously rubbish. It's a bit like dismissing the idea that people want quick fixes. Well, it seems to me people want quick fixes because we haven't got very much time. And they're right. But you may not be able to get one. And then the question becomes, I think people in a way should come for psychoanalysis when they've tried other things. So they should come out of desperation and or curiosity. Because obviously if anything worked, we'd all be doing it. But obviously there are different criteria about how therapy works. And all these are questions really about our picture of what a good life is. And a good life may be one in which we are doing as much positive thinking as we can. And hoping for the best.
I think on that note, thank you very much.